Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're speaking on the day when the new U.S. Secretary of State is in a city he knows well, Moscow. Rex Tillerson, who worked there for Exxon, first as on joint projects before becoming the CEO of the oil giant. Now he's the U.S. Secretary of State, and he's there at a time of spiking tension between Moscow and Washington over Syria. With us to talk about it from Moscow, Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. From New York City, Michael Pregent of the Hudson Institute think tank. From Istanbul, Borzur Daragahi, who is the Middle East correspondent for BuzzFeed News, and here in the studio, Elena Servataz, Editor-in-Chief of Open World, which you can find on the web and on social media. Thank you for being with us. We were talking before the break about Rex Tillerson's visit and how, well, it signals a break with the isolationism that was often espoused by Trump, the candidate, asserting the United States' right to intervene to stop what he calls the barbarism of the Syrian regime.
They had signed the chemical weapons accord themselves, the Syrian government. The Russian government had signed that accord. And now Assad has made the Russians look not so good under these circumstances. I think it's also worth thinking about Russia has really aligned itself with the Assad regime, the Iranians, and Hezbollah. Is that a long-term alliance that serves Russia's interest? Or would Russia prefer to realign with the United States, with other Western countries and Middle East countries who are seeking to resolve the Syrian crisis? We want to relieve the suffering of the Syrian people.
Andrei Kortunov, if you're in the same room as Rex Tillerson, how do you answer that question?
Well, I think that definitely Moscow will make conclusions about this whole incident, but I do not anticipate any radical changes in the Russian policy right away, because if Putin were to realign, as Secretary Tillerson says, it would be interpreted as a sign of weakness. It would be interpreted as a kind of unilateral concession to the United States and to President Trump. I'm not sure that President Putin is ready for such a concession or for such demonstration of softness or weakness.
On the hashtag F24 debate, reactions from viewers, and I'll read one of them to you, Andrei Kortunov. Tillerson is out of his league. Neocons are playing him like a fiddle. I hope he catches up to their coerced endgame. What do you think of Rex Tillerson as a choice for Secretary of State, as a Russian? What do you think of that?
Well, first of all, I think that it's good when he says something, he means it. He's a businessman. I think that our relations suffered a lot from hypocrisy on both sides, from this double speak, if you wish. He knows Russia, but at the same time,
sorry, what do you mean by double speak?
I think that his mission is not easy.
Double standard.
What do you mean by double speak?
Well, I mean that if you take... Well, I mean that in many cases, American presidents made certain statements, but they didn't really mean them. They, the notorious case of the red line of President Obama, and there was ambiguity, if you take Syria, whether the United States is in the business of a regime change or not in the business of the regime change. It was very ambiguous, very elusive in many cases. I hope that we'll have more clarity, and I'm sure that both Mr. Tillerson and President Putin are leaders of transaction type. So they know what they want, and they can have a candid talk, even if they do not agree in the end of the day.
It was very interesting that Andrei mentioned both sides' hypocrisy, because I hope that he admitted that there is a hypocrisy from Russia's side as well. And today I was watching RT, which is Russia propaganda channel, and how they describe Tillerson today, because when he he was appointed to the state secretary, everybody was saying it's a smart move, he will help, he will produce a better relations. But today they were speaking that this guy has no diplomacy experience, how he will manage this position. So, and they also underline the fact that Putin will not meet Rex Tillerson. And I see the rhetoric changing. So it's very curious to me.
Michael President, are you happy that it's Rex Tillerson and not John Kerry who's in Moscow?
Very happy. Very happy. Tillerson understands Russia's economy very well. He understands levers we can use to get Russia to... We're not asking Russia to align with the United States. We're asking Russia to stop supporting a murderous dictator. And I think there are levers there. There are a lot of economic things you can do. Of course, the G7 sanctions against Syria officers and Syrian officers and Russian officers, there was no appetite for that at this point. They didn't want to push Russia into a corner. That's understandable, but at the end of the day,
but hang on a sec, Michael. We've heard a bunch of we've heard a bunch of statements from Tillerson over the past 24 hours. We heard the clip that you just heard there. He denounces the barbarism of the Syrian regime, and then in another clip he's saying, "Well, we carried out this attack so that the chemical weapons don't get in the hands of ISIS." So sort of hinting at times that it wasn't the Syrian regime itself that he's confronting, but simply it's all just about ISIS. Do we have a clear idea of what Rex Tillerson wants?
Well, we want to stop the proliferation. If those weapons get into the hands of a Jabhat al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda affiliate, or ISIS, then they can be used external to Syria. So that is a weapons proliferation issue. So you can fall back on the legal grounds for why the U.S. took action. But I think you can also fall back on the fact that Assad is using conventional munitions to punish the civilian population, and the international community should do something as well. As far as the strategies, you can defeat ISIS, bring stability to Syria, and then work on a transition where Assad goes away. And in the meantime, you can still hit Assad's air force when it does things like this. You can still put Putin in a corner in order to get some sort of actual ceasefire where the U.S. and the West is leading the negotiations instead of Russia and Iran. And that's why we have a 5-year civil war so far.
Borzo Daragahi, you agree?
6 years.
I mean, I think that you asked a good question there. Is Tillerson outmatched? We're not sure if he's outmatched. But he's in a much, much tougher position than the Russians are right now. He's working for an administration where already a lot of sort of air has been placed between him and the White House. He has not had a chance, or Trump has not had a chance, or the desire to fill many senior posts at the State Department. He's not quite sure what the Syria policy is. There's a lot of confusion there that you sort of pointed out. And meanwhile, you have Putin, who knows exactly what he wants. He has used over the last few years a very, very sort of calculated and ruthless sort of methodology in obtaining what he wants, which is expanding Russian power and working to become a check on American power worldwide. And I think that, you know, he's not going to ditch Syria and Iran, countries that he's invested in strategically in terms of intelligence, in terms of economic sort of infrastructure, in terms of military partnership. He's not going to ditch these two countries without a very, very, very high price. And actually, I have a story about this very subject, about why Putin is definitely not going to be ditching Iran or Syria anytime soon. But he's sort of smart enough to dangle that prospect in the hopes of manipulating the Trump administration. It's on BuzzFeed right now, if you want to look at it.
He doesn't have to ditch to get what he wants, but...
Doesn't have to ditch, but let me ask you on that score, Borzo, you talk about the mixed messages coming out of Washington, but we've seen, you know, the kicking out of Steve Bannon, an isolationist from the National Security Council. Has Trump, to a certain degree, cleared the air in the past week?
I don't think so.
General...
Not yet. I mean, we'll see. Sorry.
Not
in the past week, General Madison, H.R. McMaster found out who their commander-in-chief is. Both of them presented options to the commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, and we took action. For the first time in 6 years, the Assad regime was hit by a Western power. That's important.
Does it mean, though, that does it mean now that the United States is obliged to go in every time that there's an attack against civilians?
No. Well, I mean, I would like to see that, but that's not what this policy is about. It's about stopping Assad from using chemical weapons. I would like to see us do something every time Assad does something like this.
By the way, and it's sort of important to point out that this is not the first time since 2013 that the Assad regime has allegedly used chemical weapons. I mean, there have been repeated incidents, none quite so big as this one that just happened. But you know, I mean, I wouldn't call it systematic, but I would call it a regular use of various types of chemical weapons. Sometimes crude chlorine bombs. Sometimes, obviously, something more sinister, mustard gas, perhaps some mixture with sarin as well. This is not the first time since 2013.
Andrei Kortunov, sitting in Moscow, how do you read the situation in Washington right now? Do you feel as though the hawks have won the day over the isolationists?
Well, I think it's too early to make the final judgment. The point is that the United States doesn't have a strategy. It has not made any commitment to pursue any long-term strategy in Syria. We still don't know. Maybe what Trump did was just a kind of pedagogical act, a lesson that, or a message. And maybe, you know, Damascus was not really the real target. Maybe it was about North Korea. Maybe it was about Chairman Xi. I think that it is important to get a strategy out of the White House, and then the strategy should be presented to everybody, and they should decide whether this strategy is reasonable and feasible. And I think that this is an issue that Mr. Putin will not miss a chance to raise. He would say, look, you know, you want another Iraq, you want to have another Libya, you want to have chaos, replacing a dictator. That's not good enough. I think this is the logic that will be used in this city.
Andrei, I have a question for you. I mean, if you say that Trump administration has no strategy, do you think that Russia has the same strategy everywhere? We are all the time to blame the opposition. We are all the time, you know, to introduce the fact that that's not real. Even if you are agree that it's a chemical weapon, you already made all the judgment. I mean, when you see Vladimir Putin, why it's the same all the time, the same thing?
Well, you know, I think that Russia clearly wants to maintain the Syrian state and to have some influence over this state. But to some extent, it has to take into account the interest of its partners. And I think Iran is important here because, you know, for Russia, Iran is much more than Syria. Iran is about Afghanistan. Iran is about Central Asia. Iran is about the Caspian Sea and South Caucasus. So it is very difficult to convince Mr. Putin that he should drop his current partnership with Iran and to switch to Western countries, which, by the way, do not have too much to offer Mr. Putin. I don't think that there is an exit strategy that he's ready to buy at this particular juncture.
Rex Tillerson, flying in from Tuscany, where earlier a G7 foreign ministers meeting was extended to counterparts from Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jordan, Qatar, all nations that oppose Assad's rule. And while they were meeting in Italy, the Russian president hosting his Italian counterparts. Let me ask you, Andrei Kortunov, to have the Turks there in Lucca and after having a fraught relationship of late with its NATO partners, singing from the same hymn sheet, that must have stung the Russians who you know, went to great pains to organize that three-way sit-down in Astana that included the Iranians, the Turks, who would seem to be coming around more to closer relations with Moscow over the Syria situation. Is that all over now?
Well, I hope not. And if you listen to what we hear coming from Turkey, for example, they still argue that they support the Astana process, because no matter what happens, there should be ceasefire to start with. And I'm not sure that we have any better mechanism for the time being than the Astana process. And I think that there's no alternative to the Geneva process either, because how can you fix it? How can you bring all the parties to the table if you don't use it? But the modalities, the devil is in details. I think that both the Astana process, if it survives, and definitely the Geneva process will have to change. A lot will depend on whether the United States is ready to play a more active role here.
Boris Dargai, I imagine that, with the run-up to next Sunday's referendum in Turkey, there's not much attention on Syria. But once that referendum's passed, how will the Turks react to the latest developments?
Well, I mean, I think that Turkey is playing, with regard to Syria, perhaps a smarter game at this point. It has not... the U.S. continues to use Turkey, for example, for sorties into Syria and Iraq. It uses Turkish bases, and it continues to build on relations with Russia in the wake of last year's rapprochement after the incident at the border with the downing of a Russian jet. So, I think it's playing both sides. It's sort of expanding its diplomatic portfolio very consciously after a few debacles after the Arab Spring and so on. But, for right now, they have suspended. The Turks have a military presence inside Syria with Operation Euphrates Shield. That operation is now ended. They have an area of control inside Syria. But perhaps after the referendum, after the distraction of this referendum, they will launch a new offensive operation to take more territory for their Syrian allies in the north of Syria.
Which brings us to the key question. We haven't talked much about ISIS yet, and that is the official reason why Russia, Turkey, and the United States are involved if you're saying that the Turks are getting ready to have a firmer foothold within Syria, is that going to be in coordination with both the United States and Russia?
Well, I mean, we've talked about this before, François. The problem is that, they say it's about ISIS, but, for everyone, ISIS is sort of a secondary issue, maybe except for the U.S. For Turkey, their primary issue in being inside Syria is to act as a check against the resurgent Kurds, the PKK and its affiliates. And for Russia, it says it's fighting ISIS, but it's not really fighting ISIS. It's mostly fighting rebels that are mounting a challenge to the Syrian regime. And so, you have this game going on, this complex pantomime going on, where everyone's using the pretext of fighting ISIS, but no one is really fighting ISIS except, Syrian rebels and the Kurds on the ground.
Michael Pregen, how does the United States handle Moscow in the build-up to that offensive to try to retake Raqqa?
Well, I agree with the last comments that no one's really in Syria to defeat ISIS other than the United States, and we're not doing it with the right ground force. No Sunni ground force has been created yet to retake Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. So that area is deconflicted regardless of whether or not Russia has reactivated the deconfliction hotline. The U.S. can continue to provide air support and air cover to a ground force to retake Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. But again, the hold force, the force that needs to keep ISIS out and be accepted by the residents of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, has not been created yet.
Andrei Kortunov, how does Vladimir Putin view the West at this point? It's now after we've seen, obviously we're talking about the situation in Syria, but it's all in the broader context, right, of the sanctions, the annexation of Crimea and the such. After the latest developments, is it the same Vladimir Putin as a couple of years back?
Well, I think that right now he should be irritated, specifically on the Middle East, because it worked as planned until the last couple of days when the whole strategy was challenged, and it's not clear whether this strategy can be restored. My take is that there are certain advantages for the Russian leadership in this confrontation with the West, because it keeps the society mobilized. It basically drives the public attention away from many domestic issues. But I think that Putin should not be in the mood to escalate right now. I don't think that it is in the cards, because it might be too risky, it might become too costly. I don't think that at this particular point in time he is interested in further escalation. However, the question is how to shape the exit strategy without losing face and without putting yourself into jeopardy. And this is a very delicate game. I'm not sure that people who run the country today know how to play it, because it's an entirely different ball game compared to what they had for last couple of years.
All right, how to save face, the topic for another discussion. Andrei Kortunov, many thanks for joining us from Moscow. Michael Prejin in New York City. Borzo Daragahi in Istanbul. Also want to thank as well Elena Servitaz for being with us. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. We say hello to Emma James. We were talking earlier about the mixed messages we've seen. Mixed messages, particularly out of the White House.
Yes, absolutely. Bizarrely so, you might say. It's almost as though the Trump administration is making up as it goes along. And what is interesting is obviously now Donald Trump is trying to get the rest of the world to rally behind his message, but no one's quite sure what that is. Dave Brown in the UK's independent newspaper has come up with this cartoon, and it's entitled Changing His Tune. And as you can see, he's crossed out from Russia with love, Vlad all over and walk on by, and has opted
all over.
for,
I like that.
Yes, exactly. Opted for a hard rain's gonna fall. And of course, he's conducting the G7 countries there with Boris Johnson of the United Kingdom on the triangle.
Okay.
An important role, clearly. But it is going to be a struggle for him to get people in harmony with him if the message isn't clear. And it really has been very noteworthy, certainly on social media. A lot of people talking about it. This Twitter user says, clearly Nikki Haley and Rex Tillerson don't talk enough because this is kind of ridiculous. And these comments are all from within the last 2 weeks. Nikki Haley, of course, the US ambassador to the United Nations, Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and you've got them flip-flopping days apart from one another. She's saying, we've got to get Assad out. He says steps are underway to remove him. Then she says regime change is something that we think is going to happen. Of
course, that remark coming after the chemical attack.
Absolutely. And on April the 9th, Tillerson said that it would be the Syrian people who would decide the fate of Bashar al-Assad. Of course, today, we've got a different line from him again, reporting here in the Huffington Post. It is clear to us the reign of the Assad family is coming to an end. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the US is going to fight for that regime change, but it almost amounts to that message. And it is interesting to see that the differences in the way this has been handled. Now, some remain unconvinced that those airstrikes on Syria really do signal the end of Donald Trump's rather cozy approach to Vladimir Putin. This is from Mike Lukovich in the Atlanta Journal. And he's got Putin and Assad sitting down to tea. Putin's answered the phone. It says, it's Trump. He's going to bomb one of your airfields. What time is convenient? Because, of course, what we've learned, and this is from a Pentagon official, is that Russia was told about those airstrikes in Syria before even the US Congress knew about it.
What was your reaction to that? That this is a good or a bad thing? That Russia
and I was very surprised, and actually we was also making kind of jokes about this because there's not a lot of people left on those bases, and we have 54 Tomahawks. Well, where are all the people gone?
Well, the other thing that's worth looking at today, the New York Times has retweeted this article from a couple of days after those sarin attacks. And it did comments from Haley, Tillerson and Sean Spicer, the press secretary, lead Assad to think he could get away with a chemical weapons attack. And this is a really interesting article to look back at in the light of what's happened subsequently. 4 days before the sarin attack, they were all singing from the same hymn sheet. That's on the 30th of March, saying that they weren't looking for regime change any longer. This article also points out that Trump himself had declared himself to be wholly involved in fighting against ISIS, not getting involved in Syria. So what they're saying is that basically Assad became emboldened, feeling that potentially he could do whatever he wanted and there wouldn't be any kind of blowback from the United States.
All right. Speaking of blowback, we're going to change topics here. 24 hours ago, you were telling us about that video that had gone viral, a doctor forcibly taken off a United Airlines flight. We've covered this story in business now because the stock has taken a hit. This is the mother of all PR nightmares.
Absolutely. I think we've all seen the videos by now, but just in case you haven't seen it, here's a little snippet so you get a taste of exactly what all the fuss is all about. A paying customer manhandled off the aircraft, dragged through all the other passengers, bloodied and confused to make way for other airline staff, and he was going to be given an alternative flight the following day. Now, the CEO's note to staff has actually made the problem even worse. It was already alive on social media with many people commenting. But as this person points out, it's a victim-blaming letter because what the CEO said is that he was disruptive and belligerent. Now, what is interesting is cartoonists getting in on the act with this one, and a lot of people taking note of the fact that the old motto for United Airlines, the slogan, was "Fly the Friendly Skies." And if you take a look on Twitter today, you've got plenty of tweets suggesting new United Airlines mottos, including this one: "We put the hospital in hospitality."
Oh,
and finally, United Airlines, "Pay for the seating, stay for the beating."
Oh, dear. Many thanks, Emma James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.